It started with a blocked driveway, again, before sunrise, when every minute mattered and my car sat trapped behind someone else's entitlement. The HOA called it a misunderstanding. She called it her right. I called it the last straw. Fines appeared out of nowhere. Warnings piled up. Cameras watched. Notes vanished. And suddenly the rules only applied to me. Then one morning, the driveway was clear, but not the way anyone expected. No car. No explanation. Just silence, panic, and a question that changed everything. How far can someone push you before you stop playing by their rules? Before any of this happened, life in the neighborhood was quiet in the way people hope for when they buy a home under an HOA. The streets were clean, the lawns trimmed to identical lengths, and everything followed a rhythm that felt predictable, almost comforting. I had chosen this place for that reason. A modest house, a single driveway, and a routine that worked. Mornings were about getting out on time, evenings about pulling back in without thinking twice about it. The driveway was never something I worried about. It was simply there, a small but essential piece of daily life that I assumed was mine to use without question. I wasn't new to HOAs. I knew about the rules, the emails, the seasonal reminders about trash bins and paint colors. I paid my dues on time, kept my property neat, and avoided attention. That was the unspoken agreement. If you stayed invisible, the HOA stayed out of your life. Most neighbors seemed to operate the same way. A wave here, a nod there, nothing more. It felt like a community built on mutual distance, and for a while, that was enough. The woman who lived 2 houses down didn't fit that pattern. She stood out without trying, or maybe because she was always trying. Her presence was constant. She watched. She noticed. She involved herself in things that didn't concern her. At first, it seemed harmless. Some people just liked order a little too much. Some people needed to feel useful. I didn't think much of it when I saw her walking the street slowly, scanning driveways and curb lines, phone in hand. It felt annoying, but not threatening. The first time her car blocked my driveway, I assumed it was a mistake. It was early, still dark enough that streetlights mattered, and I was already running late. The car sat there at an angle that made no sense, close enough that backing out wasn't possible. I waited, expecting it to move. It didn't. By the time it finally did, my day was already off track. One inconvenience didn't feel worth turning into a problem. Then it happened again, and again, always brief, always just long enough to disrupt my routine. Each time, there was a reason. A delivery, a visitor, a misunderstanding about where the property line actually sat. The explanations shifted, but the results stayed the same. My driveway stopped feeling like mine. It became something temporary, something I was allowed to use only when it didn't interfere with someone else's sense of control. Around the same time, HOA notices began appearing. Small things at first. Reminders about parking regulations. Clarifications about shared access areas. Language that felt generic enough to apply to anyone, yet somehow landed squarely on me. I read every word, trying to understand how rules I'd followed for years were suddenly being interpreted differently. Nothing was outright accusatory, but the tone had changed. It felt colder, sharper, like someone had started paying attention. The neighborhood itself hadn't changed, but the way it felt to live there had. Cameras on nearby houses seemed more obvious. Cars slowed down near my driveway. I noticed people watching when I pulled in or out, as if something about my property had become a point of interest. The calm I'd relied on was gone, replaced by a low-level tension that followed me home every day. I told myself it was temporary, that things like this blew over once people lost interest. But interest only grew. The driveway became a silent battleground, a strip of concrete that represented something larger than parking. It was about permission, about who decided what belonged to whom. And without realizing it, I had stepped into a situation where patience was being tested, rules were being bent, and the line between inconvenience and intimidation was starting to blur. I didn't know then how far it would go. I only knew that something small and petty had taken root, and it wasn't going to stop on its own. What had once felt like an inconvenience quickly turned into a pattern, and patterns are impossible to ignore. The driveway blockages became more deliberate, less accidental. The timing was always precise. Early mornings when being late mattered, evenings when exhaustion made patience thin. Each incident came with the same result. My car stuck, my schedule disrupted, my sense of control chipped away a little more. And every time, there was no direct confrontation, no open hostility. just a quiet assertion of dominance that left no fingerprints. Then the HOA letters escalated. The language shifted from reminders to warnings. Parking violations were suddenly documented with timestamps and blurry photos taken from angles that felt intentional. The driveway was labeled a shared access concern, even though nothing in the bylaws had changed. Fines appeared without clear explanations. Small amounts at first, just enough to feel irritating rather than catastrophic. Enough to test whether I would push back or quietly comply. I appealed one of them, believing logic still mattered. The response came back polished and impersonal, referencing sections of the rules that seemed stretched beyond recognition. It was clear someone had spent time crafting justification, twisting vague wording into something enforceable. The driveway was no longer just mine in their eyes. It was now an issue, a problem to be managed. That was when I started noticing how closely everything was being watched. Cars slowed as they passed my house. A phone camera lifted, then lowered. HOA emails arrived within hours of minor events. My trash bin out slightly early, my car parked half a foot too close to the curb. None of it felt random anymore. It felt coordinated. The woman down the street became a constant presence in my peripheral vision, always nearby when something went wrong, always absent when questions needed answers. The driveway blockages continued, but now they came with consequences. If I maneuvered too close to her car to escape, a complaint followed. If I waited and missed work, it somehow became my fault for not planning better. The rules were flexible, bending in whatever direction benefited her position. I was trapped in a system designed to wear me down without ever giving me something concrete to fight. The emotional toll was heavier than the fines. Every time I pulled onto my street, my stomach tightened. I checked the driveway before even turning the engine off. I adjusted my schedule, woke up earlier, tried to predict her movements. I installed a small camera, hoping documentation might help. Instead, it seemed to make things worse. Another letter arrived, this one questioning whether my camera placement violated privacy guidelines. The implication was clear: watching was allowed, as long as it wasn't me doing it. Neighbors who once waved now avoided eye contact. Some looked uncomfortable, others quietly curious. No one intervened. HOA politics thrived on silence. People stayed out of conflicts unless they were forced in, and I was very much alone. The fines increased. The warnings became final notices. One letter referenced potential towing if parking violations continued, even though the violations were never clearly defined. The threat hovered, vague but powerful. I realized the driveway wasn't the endgame. It was leverage, a way to push me into a mistake, into reacting emotionally, into giving them justification for something bigger. And then came the morning that confirmed it. I stepped outside to find her car positioned not just close to the driveway, but fully obstructing it. There was no room to maneuver, no plausible deniability. It sat there like a statement, daring me to do something about it. Time passed. No movement. No response. I documented everything, hands shaking, heart racing. When the car finally moved, another HOA notice arrived that afternoon. This one accusing me of harassment for recording a neighbor's vehicle. That was the moment the balance shifted. I stopped trying to resolve it through emails and appeals. I started reading. The bylaws. The county ordinances. The fine print most people never bother with. Late nights were spent cross-referencing rules, discovering inconsistencies, loopholes, and contradictions that suddenly made the situation clearer. The HOA had authority, but it wasn't unlimited. And the driveway, as it turned out, was more legally protected than they wanted residents to realize. Still, knowing that didn't make daily life easier. The harassment continued in quieter ways. Anonymous complaints. Surprise inspections. A notice about improper vehicle storage that made no sense until I realized it referred to my car being inactive while blocked in. The absurdity piled up, but the pressure was real. Each notice carried the threat of escalation, of legal action, of something that could spiral far beyond inconvenience. The woman down the street seemed emboldened. Her car lingered longer. The blockages lasted minutes instead of seconds. She knew exactly how far she could go without crossing a line, at least the line as it was currently being enforced. And the HOA stood firmly behind her, whether through incompetence or quiet agreement. I considered selling the house. The thought crept in late at night, when exhaustion blurred judgment. It would be easier to leave, to walk away from the constant stress. That's what the system counted on. But every time the idea surfaced, something else followed it. Anger. Not explosive anger, but something steadier. A refusal to be pushed out of my own home over a driveway and a power trip. That determination changed how I moved through the neighborhood. I stopped shrinking. I parked deliberately. I documented everything meticulously. I followed the rules exactly, knowing any deviation would be used against me. And I waited. Because the more confident she became, the more careless her actions grew. The tipping point came quietly. One afternoon, I received a notice that didn't come from the HOA. It came from the city. A warning about repeated parking obstructions reported in my area with a reference number attached. It wasn't addressed to me, but to the registered owner of a vehicle frequently blocking a residential driveway. For the first time, the issue had crossed outside HOA territory. That night, the driveway was blocked again. The car sat there longer than ever before, as if daring intervention. I stood inside, watching through the window, heart pounding. This wasn't just another inconvenience. This was the moment everything had been building toward. The rules she relied on didn't apply outside the HOA bubble, and she either didn't know that or didn't believe I'd do anything about it. I did. What followed set off a chain reaction no one anticipated. Authorities were contacted. Documentation was submitted. The process moved slowly at first, then all at once. By morning, the driveway was clear in a way it had never been before. But the absence of the car wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something far bigger, something that would force the HOA, the neighbor, and the entire community to confront the limits of power they'd taken for granted. And as the realization spread, one question hung in the air, unanswered and unsettling. What happens when someone finally pushes back the right way? The morning everything came to a head didn't feel dramatic at first. It felt quiet, almost suspended, like the neighborhood was holding its breath. The driveway was empty when I stepped outside, too empty, as if the absence itself was a message. For weeks, that strip of concrete had been a battleground, a place where control was asserted inch by inch. Now it sat untouched, clean, waiting. I knew better than to relax. Silence had become part of the strategy. The calm didn't last. By mid-morning, the HOA notices arrived in rapid succession. Not letters this time, but emails flagged urgent, each one more severe than the last. Accusations were stacked tightly together. Harassment, misuse of recording equipment, violation of community harmony clauses. The language was aggressive, bordering on panicked. They referenced the incident from the night before without acknowledging what had triggered it. To them, the disappearance of her car wasn't an outcome of repeated obstruction. It was an offense that needed a culprit, and they had chosen me. The fines were no longer symbolic. They were heavy, threatening liens, legal escalation. Even foreclosure language slipped into the margins. It was everything they had been building toward, unleashed all at once. The message was clear. This was the moment they expected me to fold, to panic, to apologize for causing trouble, and accept whatever punishment they decided fit. Instead, I felt something else settle in. A calm certainty replaced the anxiety that had followed me for weeks. Because this time, I wasn't reacting. I was ready. The documentation I'd gathered wasn't emotional. It was methodical. Dates, times, photos, ordinance references, correspondence trails. The driveway blockages weren't isolated incidents anymore. They were a documented pattern that extended far beyond HOA authority. The legal bombshell landed quietly but decisively. The city responded first, not with warnings, but with confirmation. The vehicle had been cited multiple times for obstructing a private driveway under municipal code. The final incident crossed the threshold for enforcement. The tow wasn't HOA-related. It was lawful, procedural, and entirely outside their control. That distinction mattered more than anything else. It stripped the HOA of the narrative they'd been crafting. When that reality sank in, the tone shifted. The HOA scrambled to regain control, but the system they relied on wasn't built for this kind of exposure. Board members contradicted previous statements. Emails walked back accusations without fully retracting them. The woman at the center of it all suddenly went quiet. No more lingering. No more carefully timed blockages. Her power evaporated the moment it faced something that didn't bend to intimidation. But the real climax wasn't private. It unfolded in the most public way possible. A special HOA meeting was announced, mandatory attendance emphasized in bold lettering. The topic was framed as a community concern, but everyone knew what it was about. By the time the meeting began, the room was full in a way it rarely was. Neighbors who had stayed silent now wanted answers. They had seen the tow truck. They had heard the rumors. And they were beginning to wonder how easily the same tactics could be turned on them. The HOA presented their version first. They spoke about order, compliance, and the importance of rules. They painted the situation as a misunderstanding escalated by non-cooperation. But something was different this time. The confidence wasn't there. The authority they leaned on felt thinner, exposed. Every vague accusation now begged for specifics they couldn't provide. Then the documentation was introduced. Not emotionally, not defensively, just fact after fact, laid out in sequence. The repeated driveway obstructions, the selective enforcement, the fines issued without basis, the complaints filed immediately after each blockage, the city citations that confirmed what the HOA had ignored. The pattern became impossible to deny once it was seen as a whole. The room shifted. Murmurs spread. Heads turned. Neighbors glanced at each other, recognizing pieces of their own experiences in the timeline. The driveway had been the trigger, but it wasn't the core issue anymore. This was about power exercised without accountability, about how easily rules could be weaponized when no one pushed back. The woman who had started it all sat silently through it. For the first time, she wasn't in control of the narrative. The behavior she had framed as community-minded vigilance now appeared obsessive, targeted, and reckless. The tow, which she likely believed would end in punishment for me, had instead exposed her actions to scrutiny that reached far beyond the HOA's walls. And the HOA had a choice to make. They could double down, risking legal consequences and public fallout. Or they could retreat, quietly undoing the damage they had done. The decision was made without ceremony. Fines were suspended. Notices were marked under review. Language softened. The aggression drained out of the room, replaced by something closer to fear. But the most powerful moment came after. When the meeting ended, neighbors didn't rush out like they usually did. They lingered. Conversations started. Stories were shared. Similar experiences surfaced, ones that had never been voiced because people assumed they were alone. The driveway dispute had cracked something open. The illusion of fairness had shattered, and once broken, it couldn't be easily repaired. Outside, the street felt different. The cameras were still there, but they didn't feel threatening anymore. The silence wasn't strategic. It was stunned. The woman who had once controlled the rhythm of my mornings avoided the area entirely. Her absence was noticeable, and not just to me. The driveway remained clear, untouched, as if everyone suddenly understood its significance. I stood there longer than necessary, taking it in. The victory wasn't loud. There was no apology, no public admission of wrongdoing. But the shift in power was undeniable. The HOA had been forced to recognize limits they pretended didn't exist. The antagonist had been publicly stripped of credibility. And the neighborhood, once held together by quiet compliance, had seen what happened when someone refused to be worn down. As I walked back inside, one thought lingered heavier than the rest. If something as small as a blocked driveway could expose so much, how many other abuses were hiding in plain sight, waiting for the wrong person to push just a little too far? The weeks after everything unraveled felt strangely quiet, but it wasn't the uneasy silence that had haunted the neighborhood before. It was a different kind of stillness, the kind that comes after something breaks and everyone is left recalculating what's possible. The driveway stayed clear. Not once. Not accidentally. Not even for a moment. What had once been a daily source of anxiety became exactly what it was always meant to be, an unremarkable strip of concrete that no longer demanded attention. The HOA's response unfolded slowly, carefully, and without apology. Official notices arrived announcing policy reviews and procedural clarifications. Language was softened. Enforcement guidelines were revised. Certain fines were quietly rescinded without explanation. Emails that once carried threats now emphasized cooperation and community harmony. It was obvious what was happening, even if no one said it out loud. The board was protecting itself, not from me, but from what had been exposed. The woman at the center of it all withdrew almost completely. Her car no longer appeared near my house or anyone else's driveway. She stopped walking the street with her phone raised, stopped lingering near other people's property. When she did appear, it was brief and deliberate, eyes down, movement controlled. The confidence that once radiated from her actions had vanished. She hadn't just lost a parking dispute. She had lost the shield she thought the HOA provided. There were consequences beyond embarrassment. The city citations followed her, not dramatically, but persistently. Administrative fees accumulated. Insurance questions arose. The kind of consequences that don't make headlines but quietly remind someone that rules still apply when authority disappears. The system she'd leaned on for power offered no protection once she crossed outside its boundaries. For me, the impact settled in gradually. The stress that had once followed me home dissolved. Mornings returned to routine. I stopped checking the driveway before bed. I stopped scanning emails with a knot in my stomach. The hyper-awareness faded, replaced by something steadier. Confidence, not arrogance. Awareness, not paranoia. I had learned the terrain, and that knowledge didn't leave once the conflict ended. Neighbors began reaching out. At first, it was subtle. A comment while taking out the trash. A quiet thank you during a walk. Then it became more direct. Stories surfaced about fines that never made sense, warnings that felt personal, rules enforced selectively. People who had assumed their experiences were isolated now recognized a pattern. The driveway dispute had been visible enough to force a conversation that had been overdue. Attendance at HOA meetings changed. People showed up. Questions were asked. Board members were challenged respectfully but firmly. Requests for transparency increased. The dynamic shifted from passive acceptance to cautious engagement. No revolution, no dramatic overthrow. Just accountability creeping back into a space where it had quietly eroded. The HOA adjusted because it had to. Legal boundaries were suddenly respected. Enforcement slowed. Complaints required documentation instead of assumptions. The board became careful, not because it had learned a moral lesson, but because it had learned a practical one. Power exercised without restraint eventually attracts attention it can't control. And that lesson spread. The neighborhood felt lighter, less watchful. People reclaimed small freedoms they'd given up without realizing it. A car parked without anxiety. A trash bin placed without fear of a warning. The invisible pressure that keeps communities obedient had loosened its grip. I didn't become a hero. There was no title, no recognition, no moment where someone declared the problem solved. That wasn't how it worked. The resolution wasn't cinematic. It was structural. It lived in policy changes, in silence where harassment used to exist, in the absence of something that once felt inevitable. And that made it more powerful. Because the truth was simple and uncomfortable. The situation had never been about a driveway. It had been about testing limits. About seeing how much inconvenience someone would tolerate before giving up. The system worked because most people didn't push back. Not because they were weak, but because they were busy, tired, and conditioned to believe resistance would only make things worse. Until it didn't. Standing in my driveway weeks later, I realized how easily the outcome could have gone the other way. One emotional response. One poorly timed confrontation. One mistake. That was what the pressure had been designed to provoke. The moment someone reacted instead of responded, the system would justify everything it had done. But preparation changed that equation. Understanding the rules mattered more than obeying them blindly. Documentation mattered more than arguments. Patience mattered more than volume. The moment authority faced structure, it collapsed under its own contradictions. That realization stayed with me, not as bitterness, but as clarity. HOAs, neighborhood boards, informal power structures, they all rely on the same thing: silence. The absence of resistance. The assumption that inconvenience is easier than conflict. And most of the time, they're right. But not always. The driveway remained clear because it had stopped being a vulnerability. It had become a boundary, clearly defined and legally supported. Once that happened, no one dared cross it again. Not because they respected me more, but because they respected consequences they couldn't control. That distinction mattered. Months later, life continued as it always had. New complaints surfaced in the community, smaller ones, quieter ones. But they were handled differently now. People asked questions sooner. They compared notes. They didn't assume authority was always right just because it was official. The culture shifted in subtle but meaningful ways. And every time I pulled into my driveway, uninterrupted, I was reminded of something that felt bigger than the conflict itself. Power doesn't disappear when challenged. It just changes hands. And sometimes, all it takes to reclaim it is refusing to move when someone keeps trying to push you out of your own space. So the question lingered, not just for me, but for anyone watching, listening, or quietly dealing with their own version of the same problem. How many people are being pressured out of what's rightfully theirs? Not because they're wrong, but because no one ever told them they were allowed to push back.